Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Reasonable Faith International Chapter Directors Monthly Book Study. This month, we are honored to have Professor Robin Collins with us today. My name is John. I am the Chapter Director for Southern Colorado. And Professor Collins is a distinguished professor at philosophy at Messiah University in Pennsylvania. Besides philosophy, he has graduate level training in theoretical physics from the University of Texas at Austin. He has written about 50 substantial articles and book chapters in philosophy across multiple areas, including philosophy of quantum mechanics, the mind-body problem, philosophy of science, and the philosophy of religion. Also, he has appeared on several nationally broadcast programs such as the PBS show Closer to Truth and Stanford University's Philosophy Talk Radio. He is internationally recognized as a leading proponent of the argument for the existence of God based on the fine-tuning of the universe for life. With funding from the John Templeton Foundation, Professor Collins has been finishing a project showing that the universe is not only fine-tuned for life, but also fine-tuned to optimize our ability to do science. Professor Collins, we are so honored that you're here.
Yeah.
So we have a format here. If this is your first time joining our international study, all the faces you see on your screen, these are men from all over the world who represent reasonable faith and our efforts to keep apologetics and Christianity a viable option for thinking men and women. And so what we're going to do this month is we're actually going to start with a question from a director. So I'm going to switch to Ian Davies. He is hailing from Wales, and he has a question for the professor. So I'll turn it over to you, Ian.
Okay. Well, good evening from Wales. I hope you're well. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me add my thanks to those of John as well. So I've got two questions. One of them is quite a technical question, which you may address as you go through your PowerPoint. So I don't know how much in that. And then the other one is a more sort of general practical question. So you use the example, the cosmological constant, as one that's appealed to very frequently. And that seems to be one of the reasons it seems to be so incredibly fine-tuned. The numbers are just I was going to say astronomical, but if I'm allowed to say that. But I just, some of the concepts had never come across before. So I was wondering if you could just sort of explain some of those. And let's say you may go into those in your PowerPoint possibly, but I'd not heard of this this idea of quintessence in the cosmological constant. And also you talked about an alternative model which seems to perhaps get away from the need for a cosmological constant, which is this model proposed by, I think it's Mina and Santiago, that doesn't require an effective cosmological constant. And they postulate this notion of a non-material substance in addition to normal matter. So, well, first of all, sort of ignorance about quintessence, and I'm absolutely fascinated by the idea that you could have a non-material substance that wasn't normal matter. So I was wondering if you could sort of just elaborate a bit on those concepts firstly.
I don't remember discussing that in my article on the non-material substance, but I will elaborate on the concepts. So what you have is really Einstein, in his equations of general relativity that are used in cosmology, he introduced a cosmological constant, and he introduced it because he was under the conviction that the universe had to be eternal, and his model predicted that the universe would either be expanding or contracting. So it was a fudge factor he introduced, which he said was the greatest mistake in his life. But later, when particle physics began to be attempted to be united with cosmology, the particle physics theories, the standard quantum field theories for particle physics, predicted or made it very, very, very likely that there'd be some sort of energy density due to those particle fields. And in addition, around 1980, there was a proposal for inflationary cosmology to attempt to solve certain fine-tuning, what they perceived as fine-tuning problems. And they introduced another form of dark energy. And What happens with dark energy is it causes the universe its expansion to accelerate. If it's positive, and it can be negative as a matter of fact, even if it's hard to conceive of that, which would cause it to contract very rapidly. So the range of possibilities for this dark energy density are about what we have, all the way to 10 to the 120th power of what we have in our universe. So it's a huge range, and unless it's in a very small range around what we have, or zero, life couldn't occur. The universe would either expand too rapidly for galaxies to form, which are then essential for the early stars to produce the elements for life, or it would contract so rapidly galaxies couldn't form at all. So it has to be in a very small range around zero. So one might initially say, oh, maybe there's just some principle of symmetry that requires it to be zero. Right? And then you could try to eliminate the fine-tuning that way. Well, that's clashes now with the discoveries from the 1990s on, that there is a small positive dark energy density in the universe. And so now you can't have a symmetry principle that forces it to zero. So now, even if you invoke some other principle, some non-material substance, whatever you have, you're still going to have to answer the question, why is whatever it is that's causing the acceleration so small when it could have been much larger? And that's one side of the problem. Another side is just the particle physics side, is that the particle physics is supposed to contribute. If you didn't have extreme fine tuning in the particle physics, you would get an enormous dark energy density due to those fields. And so there has to be an enormous fine tuning of those fields to keep them down close to zero. And that's another flip side of the problem.
So how do you think about these new things? We've recently seen in the news that scientists think that they possibly found a fifth force now with this muon vibration. Have you seen that?
I haven't kept up with that. No, the fifth force. I mean, they've been saying things like that for a long time, right?
I'm just wondering how these
the muon. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Some sort of new physics. That would be a fifth force, which would be a new kind of interaction, the Z prime boson. That's not really relevant to this. Even if you had another force, it would still have to be fine-tuned, for example, to get it to zero, near zero, when it could have been all these other values. And moreover, it would have to be fine-tuned such that it would cancel whatever combination of things you have to be such that it cancels this huge contribution coming from the quantum field theory of particles. So that's why it's doesn't have any easy solution. Yeah. And that's why it's been the most discussed problem. There's no easy way around it.
Do you think, I mean, we quite often we like to pick the most dramatic example. I think that's possibly kind of leads into my sort of pragmatic question, which is, so how can we best use your approach to the teleological argument in our own apologetics work with reasonable faith? So if we're talking more to sort of lay people, and as I'm sure you know, Dr. Craig uses a deductive argument rather than your epistemic probability. Do you think that there's room to use the two together, or would you think that they're different methods? And the other thing I was wondering was, where would you put inference to the best explanation type arguments? Would you say that's sort of more on the epistemic probability side, perhaps?
Yeah, it's more on the epistemic probability side. I think for the apologetics to get into Bayes' theorem and stuff like that probably adds an unneeded complication for most people. So after presenting the evidence, I look at, everybody see the slide?
Yes, we do, sir.
I look at what are the alternatives, the non-theistic alternatives. And there's basically two of them. The multiverse and which I get on the next slide here, the lucky accident hypothesis. Okay, that gets into the probability issues. So there you can look at here, the universe is analogous to an ink spill, or that gives a picture of Abraham Lincoln with all the dots arranged just right. And often I give to students, like if you pull out the back of your refrigerator, a bunch of mold from your roommate, and it has this picture on it, you don't think it just happened by chance because it's way too improbable. So it's not only very improbable, but it has special meaningful features. So whenever we see that, both high improbability, which in this case means there's huge number of alternative arrangements of the ink dots that don't have any meaning to us at all, don't seem special in any way. So whenever you see that kind of improbability, and there you can even invoke a non-epistemic notion if you want, because that would just be a huge number of alternative arrangements. That corresponds to the classical notion of probability. And it has just a arrangement that's very special. Then we infer that some sort of design or some other kind of explanation, we don't just accept it as a chance occurrence. Does that help?
Yeah, that's sort of like Dembski's specified complexity, intelligent design.
Right, but here I disagree with this. How I don't think you give an objective account of the specification like he does. You can also frame it this way: we should choose a hypothesis that reduces the overall improbability of everything considered, or is least coincidental. So if you think this just happened by chance, that's hugely coincidental. By thinking, your roommate did it, then you've reduced the coincidence. That new coincidence you've entered, that there was this ink splotch just right, now is eliminated by the roommate hypothesis without adding any new coincidences, because it's not really very coincidental that the roommate would do that. So that's an easier way to go apologetically.
I like that sort of refuting the brute fact hypothesis, because people seem to appeal to that quite a lot, don't they? It's just a brute fact, but...
Now, there's something you have to address that's going to immediately come up. Well, don't you add, doesn't God need just as much design, or isn't God's mind just have to be just as highly ordered as the ink splotch here or more, right? So what about the introducing, when you introduce God as a designer, you are now introducing a whole bunch of new coincidences that all the parts of God's mind have to be arranged just right. So that's Dawkins' kind of objection. And I think there's an easy answer to it, which I could go into if you want.
Yes, I think that would be fantastic, Professor.
Because that's going to be my experience when I give this presentation at a secular university. The Skeptics Club shows up, and they think they're just going to completely nail me with Dawkins' objection that I've never thought about that. And that objection is, well, the designer would need just as have to be at least as wonderfully designed as the artifact you're trying to explain. So here, here's an extraordinarily common objection: who designed God? If the universe is wonderfully designed, surely God is even more wonderfully designed. He must therefore had a designer even more wonderful than he is. If God did not require a designer, then there is no reason why such a relatively less wonderful thing as a universe needed one. So the idea behind this objection is that explanation must stop somewhere. We are better off accepting the universe as the ultimate brute fact than God as the ultimate brute fact, since the latter just transfers the problem of design up one level. But so you have to fine-tune God as the idea. And if you look at why something needs fine-tuning, you'll see it doesn't apply to God. Why the picture on the left needs an explanation is that it's composed of parts, small ink spots and white areas that must be arranged in just the right way to make a meaningful pattern. Whereas the overwhelming vast majority of arrangements of ink spots and white areas do not result in a meaningful pattern. But if you look at the case, now if you go to God, if you had an anthropomorphic conception of God, like the Mormons do, like has a mind and, you know, a brain, then that brain would have to have all the matter in it very finely tuned and organized in order for it to think. So if you have an extraterrestrial in another universe, for example, creating our bubble universe, and that's your explanation of fine tuning, then the who designed the extraterrestrial problem arises, right? So you haven't made any explanatory progress. But in the case of classical theism, has always been conceived as infinite and unbounded, and hence has no internal complexity. It's not like God has parts that you have to shift around. So there is no fine tuning necessary for God. And part of that is the fact that God is infinite and unbounded. If God had bounds or there was multiple gods, then you'd have to have laws which would have to be fine tuned to specify what each God could do and how they could interact, or any finite God. So if you had a finite God in power that could create unicorns but not centaurs, then there'd have to be some set of laws specifying that. You would kick a fine tuning up to a higher level. But so the infinity and unboundedness of God and the fact that it's been always believed that God doesn't have internal parts means that God doesn't need any fine tuning. So the choice is between a huge amount of fine tuning necessary or belief in this sort of God. And in fact, I would say this is the only hypothesis that can really eliminate fine tuning altogether. You need something like this to do it. And I could go on and say why.
Does that require a doctrine of divine simplicity in that instance?
No. I mean, doctrine of divine simplicity is about the properties of God all being identical to each other. It's not whether God has parts or not.
Yeah.
So this is the unbounded character of God, not whether simplicity. So you could think of this as God is an unbounded conscious mind, and then minds come with wills. And if the mind is unbounded consciousness, then it's going to have unbounded knowledge and an unbounded will. So it's going to be omnipotent. And then you get the whole shebang there. And recently I gave a presentation why this is really the only, something like this is the only way of accounting for fine tuning. So there's really, all the other ones are going to push the fine tuning problem up a level. So you really hone in on the theistic God.
Yeah, this is wonderful, Professor. And Ian, great questions. If any of you listening, if this is your first time, once again, this is the monthly International Chapter Directors book study for reasonable faith. The man that you just heard asking questions to Professor Collins was Ian Davies, a very intelligent and well-gifted chapter director in Wales. If you have the opportunity to connect with him, please do. Thank you, Ian. We're now going to shift to Colombia. The director on the call here, David Fairburn, will be bringing our next question. So,
could I elaborate just a little more on this point to kind of finish?
Absolutely,
okay,
Professor.
So here's another intuition people have, and I want to elaborate why you actually need God to fully explain fine tuning you have. So the intuition they have that's kind of driving like the Dawkins argument, and there's a whole bunch of other people raise arguments like that, is that if you have an artifact, if some designer creates an artifact, they have to have a blueprint for it. And the blueprint has to be as complex as the artifact. That's another way it's often put. Now, in the case of God, God would have a blueprint in God's mind, but those blueprints in God's mind are possible worlds, what philosophers call possible worlds. And a lot of people, even non-theists, believe in them for independent reason. So what you have is in God's mind is represented all blueprints, all possible blueprints are there. And so there is the design question is why this blueprint is actualized versus another. And that's where you bring in God's goodness. So God's goodness, because God's perfectly good, if God has a reason to actualize a blueprint where you have what I call embodied conscious agents like us, because if you can glimpse some good. So God creates beings like us because they add value to reality. Us being able to commune with God, to connect with each other, etc. So there's no coincidence there. If God's good, now maybe there's a coincidence of God being good. Well, you can get God's goodness, as Swinburne does, out of God's omniscience and his unlimitedness. He has an unlimited will. So he's perfectly free. There's nothing binding God. And it goes back to a thesis going back to Plato, that the only reason people do evil is either they're ignorant of the good or because they have some other contrary desire pushing them towards evil. Well, God doesn't have a contrary desire pushing him towards evil, and God is not ignorant of the good if God's omniscient. So the idea here is the attribute of good is self-motivating, gives any rational agent a reason to bring it about. If you recognize something as good, that's automatically going to give you some motivation to bring it about, some attraction to it. So then it's not a coincidence that God is good. God's being is not coincidental because it's unbounded. There's no fine-tuning or coincidence. And it's not coincidental that this blueprint's actualized. So you get a kind of complete explanation. You need all those elements together. If you don't have the God, then you can't link. It's hard to link why and a universe with embodied conscious agents versus any other.
Wonderful. Wonderful. If you're just joining us, if you got in late, the man that you just heard speaking is Professor Robin Collins, Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Messiah University in Pennsylvania. So now we're going to shift to British Columbia. David, if you wanted to unmute and share your question with the professor, please.
All right. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for adding the British Columbia, because I'm definitely not in Columbia. We're up here in the frozen north. So, yeah, thanks for joining us and talking about this, Dr. Collins. I really appreciate it. My question has to do with an objection I came across. I always go to the internet for some of the zaniest objections, and this is one that I didn't have an answer to. Now, I'm not sure if this applies strictly to your formulation of it. More, I see yours as an abductive argument. This might be more in response to Dr. Craig's deductive version, but I think it has some bite, which is, I think it's a bad objection, but I think it could be, somebody might be misled by it. Anyways, it was that the range of life permitting values, they are countably infinite or uncountably infinite, and the range of possible values is uncountably infinite, and so you can't produce any probability. So it's a little bit different than the normalizability argument that I've seen, where it's that any given value C could have an infinite range of values. This one is that the life permitting values themselves could have had any number of infinite values and still fall into that narrow life permitting range. I think in your chapter you called it W prime. So I guess the question is that can we still run probability on something where you have a potentially infinite number of subdivisible parts in the life permitting range?
That's actually quite easy one to answer, because it's standard to have probabilities for those cases within science. That's where you go from discrete probabilities to what's called a probability distribution. So probability distributions are over continuous spaces. So like in physics, for example, you put a probability distribution in classical statistical mechanics over all the positions and momenta of the particles, and you give them an equal probability distribution. And then from there, you can, you derive the second law of thermodynamics and other things. So you don't need a discrete number of alternatives that can be continuous, but then you have to have what they call a measure. And one used in statistical mechanics is an equal probability measure. In my article, I suggest that you, what I call the restricted principle of indifference, you put a measure over a natural variable. And if there's multiple natural variables, then you would have multiple measures. And as long as the measures are within some bound, let's suppose you had a measure that said 1 in, a million, another said 1 in a trillion, then it's somewhere between 1 in a million and 1 in a trillion, if that's the range of natural measures. So the infinity problem is already dealt with in the sciences. That makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, because we do it in other areas. I think it's almost like a special pleading case, because you would never prohibit probability in other calculations unless it was for an they only use this as an objection because it's for an argument for the existence of God.
Right. In other areas, that's where it's called a probability distribution over, in statistics, it's called a probability distribution over a random variable, let's say X. So you have like bell curves can be given. So over the a continuous random variable, you can either have continuous or discrete random variables. And discrete, then it's discrete probabilities. In continuous cases, it's called a probability distribution. So in mine, it's an equal probability distribution. And then you have to choose what your variable is, that it's an equal probability distribution. And I give criteria. It has to be natural, part of the simplest formulation of your physics, for instance, or correspond to some physical magnitude, like mass would be a natural variable because we think it corresponds to something physical in the world.
Right. Great. That's great. Yeah, I need to brush up on my my probability, I think. And that's a good motivation. Thank you very much.
All right.
Great question, David. If you are joining us for the call, watching this recording after it has gone live on YouTube, and you are in British Columbia, know that David is doing some great work out there. You can find his email on reasonablefaith.org. So what we're going to do now is we're going to transition to a question and answer at large for the rest of the directors. If you'd like Professor Collins to end this, I could take it back, or we could stay here. If there's any other directors at this time that would like to unmute, state your name and where you're from. If you have a question for the professor, we have time, a little time.
Yes, I'm Dave McCarter, and I'm from the great metropolis of Oblong, Illinois.
Okay. I'm just trying to find where I see you on the...
Pardon?
Yeah, there I see you right there. Okay.
Okay. And Dr. Collins, it's, of course, been about 10 years since you wrote the article. Is there any other, what are the, say, current articles that we should be aware of that impinge upon what you've written here?
You should definitely be aware of a book by Luke Barnes, and forgot the other author's name. But if you look at Luke Barnes, I think it's something called A Fortunate Universe. He's an astrophysicist. Yeah, you should definitely be aware of that. That's the most recent kind of analysis of the data.
Yeah, I've seen him on YouTube, and yeah, appreciated some of what he had to say.
Other than that, I mean, there's just a lot of I have a hard time keeping up just in review. I often sent articles to review. So, because I'm working on this fine tuning for scientific discovery, there's just a huge bunch of stuff out there on fine tuning, and I don't have any that are particularly outstanding that, I'd recommend except for that book.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful question, David. Thank you so much. We have time for maybe one or two more questions, and then the professor has some current research that he's been working on for about a decade that he might be able to briefly discuss with us. And I know we're all very excited for that. So if there's any one or two more that would like to briefly unmute, state your name and where you are from for our listeners, you can do that at this time.
My name is Mark Burris, and I'm from the small town of Cincinnati, Ohio. And following, I appreciated the suggestion regarding Bayesian probability and the normal apologetic audience. But I wanted to follow up on the question just stated, and that had to do with a recent book by Michio Kaku. I don't know if you've read it recently.
Yeah, I know who he is. I don't know if
Okay. Okay, sorry. He's still, of course, a proponent of superstring. You know, he has sort of invested interest in that, I guess. I'm not aware that has any implication. Well, I'll put it like this: we do know that it seems that regardless of how deep we go, fine tuning is still required.
Right.
And I don't know if you have anything to say about because this is a question I've encountered already. It's sort of a new book. If perhaps Michio's recent work would have any impact on the argument from fine tuning.
Is he defending superstring theory?
Yeah, he always does.
Okay, he always defends. I mean, that's the scenario I look at in depth. There's an article, not only my main article, but an article I wrote for an edited collection with Cambridge. Dealt with the physics of the multiverse inflationary superstring scenario. So that's by far the most plausible physical scenario for fine tuning. And the way you're still, no matter how you hack it, you still have fine tuning. You have to have at the very least, at the level of the laws themselves. So you have to have the right sort of laws to get a universe that permits life. There's also this ugly little problem for any multiverse theory called the Boltzmann brain problem. And that comes from the order of the universe, not so much the constants, but the low entropy. Entropy is cashed out. The lower the entropy, the more highly it is ordered. So our universe starts off with a really, really low entropy. If it didn't, we couldn't have stars or galaxies or things like that. And that state is enormously improbable. I mean, that's the most improbable of them all, of the fine tunings. Like under the standard measure of statistical mechanics, it's 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power. So that's 10 raised to the power of 10 to the 123rd power. That's just unimaginably huge amount of fine tuning. So what is it's much more probable, the problem is that if it just that configuration was a result of chance, it's vastly more probable to get isolated regions of order than the whole universe ordered. Here's an analogy. Let's suppose an ordering of the letters to form a single word gives you the order required to have an observer, like a brain, right? So let's do that as an analogy. And so there's monkeys typing on a typewriter. And occasionally they're going to get a single word, right? So there'd be the order for an observer, a single word coming out. But it's almost always going to be the case that that single word is going to be surrounded by a scramble of letters. It'd be utterly, utterly improbable for that single word, which is an observer, to be surrounded by text with that made sense, that has all the letters are ordered to form words and then to form sentences. Well, that's what we find ourselves in our universe. So the prediction of the multiverse hypothesis along with the standard measure of statistical mechanics, predicts that we should be Boltzmann brains. And that's clearly a refuted prediction. Even if we would expect to be flickers of consciousness with chaos, both towards the future and towards the past and everywhere around us. And that's not what we find.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Great question, Mark. If you guys are in the Cincinnati, Ohio area and you're listening to the call, Mark is doing great work. I believe Mark's also a pastor. Mark's doing great work in Cincinnati, so please feel free to connect with him at
Did you follow that?
reasonablefaith.org.
Did you follow that okay?
Mark may have muted, but Mark's
sorry about that. I was muted.
yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Collins.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. So the final question for today comes from Argentina. Because of how many time zones are on the call, we actually speak multiple languages. I will be reading this for our director in Argentina. But Professor, I'll put this in your court, let you see how you want to respond to this, and then give you the last couple minutes to share any of your current research. So the question is like this. The director, whose name is Sebastian, would like to know if you could just speak about the fine-tuning of inflationary cosmology, about the compatibility of theism and the multiverse. He believes that those are related issues, since inflationary cosmology is one of the pillars that supports the multiverse hypothesis. So he's just inviting you to share your thoughts on the fine-tuning of inflationary cosmology and the compatibility of theism and the multiverse.
So the inflationary cosmology, there's a kind of heuristic sort of, you can kind of glimpse how it might resolve the Boltzmann brain problem. So that's one reason you can get this ordered universe. But the problem it runs into is that you have to have just the right laws in order to have a universe that's undergoing inflation and that gives rise to a universe that's viable for life. Okay, so you have to have universes that undergo inflation, produce multiple universes where the constants change. So you not only have to produce many, many universes, but ones where the constants change in the universe. And that the laws are also compatible with one of those universes being life permitting. So you first need a fine tuning at the level of laws, but it also appears that all the models people have looked at, you also need a fine tuning at the level of the initial conditions for inflation to occur. So that at the end of the day, there's no recognized inflationary model that will resolve the problems, particularly the Boltzmann brain problem.
Wonderful. And then on the issue of the compatibility of theism and the multiverse, did you want to speak any more onto that, or?
Well, I mean, I think theism is compatible with multiverse. I mean, God might have, I think God is an infinite God and infinitely creative. So for me, it's actually, I would expect there to be either other universes or other realities like you have in the Narnia tales. I mean, other realities with embodied conscious agents like us. If it's good for us to exist, it very well might be good for additional other kinds of beings to exist that are embodied and can form relationships. So I think that theism is compatible with a multiverse and a multiple reality situation. In fact, I think you'd even expect it. The multiverse would have to be the right kind, where not any old set of law structures or constants would be allowed, because some might create horrible worlds that would just be by their nature horrible. And so you might have a restricted multiverse.
I have to say, Professor, you giving me hope in Narnia is the highlight of my week. So thank you for that.
Well, also, if you liked Lord of the Rings, there could be universes where there's, as long as they're consistent, where there's hobbits and stuff. Unfortunately, we can't go there and visit Gandalf.
Oh man, this just got so good though.
Or if you like Star Trek, there are Klingons and Romulans somewhere, but
yes,
scientific discovery. So I'll just give you the real basics here. We already went through there's background here and the fine tuning for life. And one piece of background I didn't stress is the multiverse hypothesis is by far the most widely advocated hypothesis by cosmologists and scientists. Most scientists who think about this just reject that it's just a brute fact that requires no explanation. No, some philosophers go there, but not the scientist. And that hypothesis relies on what's called the observer selection effect. So under the multiverse hypothesis, First of all, if there's enough universes and they have varying laws and values for the fundamental parameters of physics, so on and so forth, it's no coincidence that eventually one will exist that is just right for life. So it eliminates the coincidence of there being a universe that's just right for life. It eliminates also the coincidence of us finding ourselves in a universe that is just right for life because we couldn't exist in any other universe. Eliminating that coincidence is done via what's called the observer selection effect. Observers can only exist in universes that are life permitting. Now, there's a little subtlety about that because you could exist as an observer in a Boltzmann brane. So that's where that still runs into problems because it doesn't favor non-Boltzmann brane universes over those with Boltzmann brane, just fluctuation observers. But ignoring that problem, you have this observer selection effect. So that's how the multiverse works. It renders both of those unsurprising. Now for the fine-tuning for discovery, the fine-tuning for discovery cannot be explained that way. Multiverse can't make any headway against it. And let me explain what that is here. It's already been noticed by many physicists and philosophers that the fundamental order of nature is much more science-friendly than would be expected by chance. So here's examples from Albert Einstein, probably the greatest physicist of the 20th century. The most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it is comprehensible. Or Eugene Wigner, the miracle of and he was a major founder of quantum mechanics. The miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. Paul Davies has noted that this, what he calls the intelligibility or understandability factor, cannot be explained by universe explanations. He said it is perfectly possible for there to exist a universe that permits the existence of observers, who nonetheless do not or cannot make much sense of nature. In fact, the physics of our universe is extremely special, being both simple and comprehensible to the human mind. This understandability factor is left out of anthropic multiverse explanations. So here's one thing to put it. If its universe is really fine-tuned for scientific discovery over and above the production of observers, then we're in this sort of situation. In the vast majority of universes in the multiverse, physicists and scientists are sort of sad because things aren't so good for scientific discovery. But here's our universe, happy scientists. They're especially good in our universe. The multiverse cannot explain that, why we exist in this universe as generic, randomly selected observers instead of why didn't we find ourselves in one of these others? And so it's beyond a multiverse explanation because no observer selection effect comes into play. We can exist in all these not so good universes. So it seems very unlikely. And then I'm going to go down here. Now, what have I added to this? Well, I found a way of quantifying and testing this thesis. We can examine the effect on our ability to discover the universe of varying the fundamental values of the fundamental parameters of physics. So we can look like varying the mass of the proton, the neutron, or even more fundamentally, the quarks, and see if the universe becomes less or more discoverable. If it becomes less discoverable, and it's only a small range in which it's maximally discoverable, then that would be a fine-tuning for scientific discovery. And so what did I focus on? Well, it's the effect of making these variations on our tools for discovery, like the light microscope, for instance. And my thesis was that I started off with is for these parameters, they had to be in a really narrow range of their their life permitting range in order to be maximally useful. And so then I go down to here. The first thing I looked at, this was 2010. If somebody had their hand raised, still.
We are going to transition to the end after your presentation, and we will not have any further questions. So you're free to keep where you are, Professor.
Okay, I'm trying to give the basic idea. So the first thing I looked at is a constant called the fine structure constant. This was in 2010, and it governs the strength of the electromagnetic force. If it were larger, the electromagnetic force would be stronger. If smaller, it would be weaker. That's the unification of an electric force, like between protons and neutrons, and the magnetic force, done by James Clerk Maxwell in the 1800s. And what I found out is that if you increase just slightly the fine structure constant compared to its possible range of values, you couldn't have open wood fires. They would go out. And open wood fires were essential to human beings discovering how to forge and smelt metals, which is essential to our scientific civilization. So why is that? Well, here's interesting for all those who've been around campfires. What is alpha squared? Well, let's look at a campfire. Energy conservation requires that the amount of energy released by combustion equals the amount given off in radiation plus the amount going out in smoke, called convection, right? So there's an energy balance. Now, the radiation emitted, when you stand away from a fire, you feel the heat coming from it. That's the radiation giving off. It's mostly what's called black body radiation. That's proportional to alpha squared. So if I were to double alpha, you would have 4 times as much radiation being emitted. Increase alpha enough, the fire would go out. You'd be sucking the energy from it, lowering the temperature below the combustion point. So increase alpha increases radiant energy emitted, more energy leaving the fire, a drop in the temperature of the fire. Now, you can do all this in what's called atomic units, in which combustion and convection rate do not change. All you get is an increase in the radiant energy. So if you work through this, you get about 10 to 40% over a huge range of different kinds of biomass. The fire will go out. But that's over a vastly larger range of the possible values of the fine structure constant. And you can already see we're right on the edge, meaning that it already is too high unless energy is coming back. So this is why if you ever have a wood fire and you turn those sticks over, this side is still getting plenty of oxygen. But why isn't it combusting? Because there's too much radiant energy leaving, and so it can't stay above the combustion point. That's why the only sites that are burning are those that are getting radiant energy back. So if you ever have a fire, and I had a wood stove at the time, it explained how my wood stove worked, why my logs would go out. Okay. So what's the significance of that? It's on this edge. Why would you want it on the edge? Well, if you decrease it, then the alpha, less and less radiant energy is emitted, and then this side starts burning. Well, then you have more forest fires. Your house is burned down way more because it's much easier for wood to stay burning. Usually in a forest fire or a fire that started on a piece of wood in a house, it will just go out because too much radiant energy, unless it's against something else. So likewise in forests, so it would be bad either way. So it has to be no open biomass fires, increase it this way. There's forest fire problem, etc. So its current value is this, 1 over 137. So that was the first case I discovered of this fine tuning. Also, other interesting things happen. Decrease it. You decrease the resolving power of light microscopes. And as a matter of, and you need light microscopes to see living organisms. You can look at things under electron microscopes, but you have to kill them first. You can't see living cells under electron microscopes. And it's set now, so the maximum resolving power of a light microscope is 0.2 microns, and the smallest living cell is 0.2 microns. So it's just as high as it could be, to allow you to see the smallest living cell. You lose the efficiency of electric transformers and motors. So there's also bad news going the other direction, decreasing it. So it seems for multiple reasons, it has to be in this small little area for maximum technology. And go here, you don't have any technology at all because you can't smelt metals. You will never discover how to smelt metals. Go this way, there's a whole bunch of other problems arise. So here is my second case. So the second case was of the cosmic microwave background radiation. There's this radiation that permeates space called the cosmic microwave background radiation. It's pretty weak. You can't go out in outer space and cook a hot dog, so don't try it. But it permeates space in all directions, and it was discovered in 1966 by accident. And it is the strongest evidence for the Big Bang Theory because it's predicted by the Big Bang Theory. It's microwave because it was really, really hot, the universe at the beginning. And as space expands, as in the Big Bang Theory, the wavelength gets stretched from the visible region to the microwave region where we're at in our point in cosmic history now. Now, this radiation, because it permeates the whole universe, it gives you information about the structure of the entire universe. So it's the most important tool. Somebody maybe the chat. Okay, it's the most important tool of cosmology. Say Baryon and Templeton say it's the Rosetta Stone, and the more intense it is, the better, because they're looking at very, very small ripples in it to test cosmological theories. But it depends on a ratio called the baryon to photon ratio, the number of protons plus neutrons divided in the universe divided by photons of light, which are particles of light. And that, for an unknown reason, that goes back to a slight difference in matter antimatter. There's antimatter, like for a proton, there's an antiproton. For an electron, there's an anti-electron. So for every billion antiprotons, there was 1,000,000,001 protons. So that ratio, the ratio we have in our universe, goes back to that. And my thesis predicted that the baryon to photon ratio in our universe should maximize the intensity of the cosmic microwave background radiation. Now, I initially did this calculation in fall of 2010. I started because I discovered the other thesis, so I went on to looking at this cosmic microwave background radiation, and I thought I'd refuted my thesis, but I made a mistake in my calculation. In the spring, in January, I realized the mistake I made, recalculated, and that was the result I got. Here we are, right here. This is alternative universes, which have a different ratio of baryons to photons. We're at just the point where the cosmic microwave background radiation maximizes over, at least a variation of 1 billion-fold in this thing. So it was very, very impressive. And so I sent this result off to a couple cosmologists I know. And then I sent it off to Luke Barnes, who wrote that book. And he ended up sending me back another way of calculating the same result I got. They all confirmed it. So that was the very most impressive case at that time. And I looked at a lot of other parameters. There was similar fine tuning, but not nearly as impressive. And then I'm going to make the end here very quickly because I can't go into all the details on this one. So eventually led me to particle physics in 2014. And I wanted to find these parameters that when you changed them, they wouldn't affect life. So there'd be a range, an anthropic range form, a range that would be life permitting, and then see if there was a small range within that that would be maximal for discoverability. Well, in particle physics, protons and neutrons are made of quarks, and then you have the electron, which is what's called an lepton. And just to make this really short, there's a whole class of fundamental particles given by this diagram here. The Higgs boson's been what's recently discussed. recently discovered. And here's the muon that somebody mentioned earlier. So for each particle here, for quarks, they come in two different types, and there's always three generations. So there's this generation, that generation, that, which are just heavy sisters of the up quark, has same properties except much heavier. Here you get the top quark, and likewise for the strange and bottom quark and the muon and tau lepton, and you get the same thing for the neutrino sector and then for the Higgs boson. So I wanted to look at what happened when you varied the mass of these things. They don't last very long. Like the bottom quark is one of the longer lasting of them, and it lasts about a trillionth of a second. So we're not talking, so they can't have any effect on life. They disappear. They only exist in particle accelerators, but they can affect discoverability, especially in particle physics. So I varied these, and what I found is each of them maximizes in a small range our ability to discover the universe. In particular, some contributor to discoverability, like this one here is in a very, very small range that maximizes the use of the muon, can be used as like a, it's being produced all the time in the atmosphere, and it's highly penetrating, can penetrate hundreds of meters of material. And it's used for image, like an X-ray for imaging particle detectors underground, for mining, and it has just this very small range of values that maximizes its usefulness for that, as one example. So that's and I'm finishing up this work on this. Right now, I'm just in the stage of trying to simplify everything so it's maximally understandable. I've kind of got all the data. So it all turned out, but that was a huge amount of work. But one of the big significance of this is it can't be explained by the multiverse for the reasons I explained. So it is a test of the multiverse versus theism, and has major theological implications, particularly the fine-tuning for scientific discovery. The fact the universe is discoverable using the methods of science wasn't just an accidental byproduct of some other goal God had in mind. In order for this to be fine-tuned, God would have to directly do it. So there's a providential purpose in us developing science. So what was that providential purpose of the development of science and the reason it has to go into it? That's an interesting area of theological exploration.
Very much, very much. And we all know that there are many people out there who, I'm going to just transition the screen here. We all know that there are many people out there who don't agree with the stance taken by yourself, by Dr. William Lane Craig, and have often commented that science may have needed religion to get going, but it parted ways as it left its adolescence. And I think the research that you're doing now is showing that actually the whole purpose behind science was a goal in and of itself. So if you all could help me in giving a round of applause to the professor. If you joined us late, the brilliant man that you heard talking on his incredible research is none other than Dr. Robin Collins, who is a professor at Messiah University. We will be making this recording available. The men that you see on the screen there, if you're new to this format, they represent co-laborers with Dr. William Lane Craig around the world as we enter into universities, organizations, and churches to discuss why Christianity is and will always be a rational option for thinking men and women. Join us next month. We have already had the pleasure of confirming Dr. J.P. Moreland, who will be joining us next month to discuss his research around consciousness. Very, very exciting. Regional Director Charles Honeycutt on the call has done a great job month in and month out, bringing in top speakers like Professor Collins. So with that, we thank you guys for joining us for this iteration of our monthly call, and we look forward to speaking to you guys next time.